She thought she was about to secure another viral takedown. Instead, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked directly into a political massacre. On live national television, she stared straight into the eyes of Senator John Kennedy and arrogantly labeled him a walking punchline. She was likely already picturing the trending hashtags and the glowing media coverage. But she completely forgot one lethal detail. She was dealing with a 73-year-old financial assassin who was about to use a 99-cent yellow legal pad to systematically dismantle her entire political identity, leaving the loudest progressive in America completely speechless for 8 agonizing seconds. Stick around, because you are about to witness the exact moment a multi-million-dollar political brand gets brutally audited by reality. For 2 grueling hours and 13 minutes, the Senate Budget Committee hearing had been a graveyard of dry procedural monotony. The official agenda, long-term fiscal sustainability, was the kind of bureaucratic anesthesia that normally only attracts C-SPAN insomniacs. The CNN cameras parked in the back of the room were completely dormant. The public gallery was half empty, echoing only with the quiet, tired rustle of shuffling papers. But the Democratic members of the committee had engineered a highly calculated ambush. They had invited Ocasio-Cortez to drop a legislative bombshell, the Green New Deal 2 framework. The strategy was a masterclass in modern political theater. The very second her name echoed through the chamber as the next witness, the heavy oak doors of the gallery violently swung open. The room instantly packed shoulder to shoulder to absolute capacity. CNN frantically scrambled to push their feed to live national coverage. Social media algorithms ignited in pure anticipation of a spectacular clash. Seated across the heavy wooden dais, waiting patiently in the eye of the storm, was Senator John Kennedy. Clad in a conservative dark suit and a meticulously patterned tie, his reading glasses perched precariously near the end of his nose, he looked exactly like a relic from a bygone era of Washington. In front of him lay nothing but a cheap yellow legal pad and a standard pen. While the rest of the room buzzed with electric, chaotic tension, Kennedy simply tapped his pen against the paper in a slow, steady, hypnotic rhythm. Throughout the morning, he had radiated an aura of unhurried patience, quietly scratching down notes with the lethal, deliberate focus of a master sniper waiting for the wind to die down. When Ocasio-Cortez seized the microphone, she instantly commanded all the oxygen in the room. For 10 blistering, uninterrupted minutes, she delivered a dazzling, virtuoso performance. She spoke entirely without notes. She locked her burning eyes onto individual senators, practically daring them to blink as she recited complex climate data entirely from memory. She painted terrifying cinematic visions for the committee, streets swallowed by surging floodwaters in Queens, blistering heat waves suffocating Phoenix, and merciless droughts crippling California. With surgical precision, she seamlessly tied every localized disaster directly to her sweeping multi-trillion-dollar framework. The Democrats nodded in awestruck, unified approval. The Republicans sat back, paralyzed in silence, carefully taking their notes. She was passionate, fiercely specific, and undeniably compelling. It was a brilliant, perfectly executed trap. She just had absolutely no idea that the real trap had already been set for her. But then, precisely at the 8-minute mark of her impassioned monologue, Ocasio-Cortez made the single, fateful decision that would not only define the remainder of the hearing, but would ultimately reshape the entire trajectory of her carefully curated political career. She pivoted her body away from the General Committee and directed her intense, burning gaze toward one man. "And I want to speak directly to Senator Kennedy," she declared, raising her hand and pointing a firm, accusatory finger directly at him from the witness table. Her voice adopted a sharp, preemptive edge, "Because I know what's coming. I know he's sitting there right now thinking of some clever little country saying some folksy zinger that'll play great on Fox News tonight." Kennedy simply paused his rhythmic tapping. He looked up from the pale yellow glow of his legal pad with an expression of mild, detached interest, the exact way a man might look up if he suddenly heard his name called out in a crowded restaurant. Ocasio-Cortez leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes narrowing as she delivered the blow. Senator, with all due respect, you are the reason this institution is broken. You've been in government for 30 years. State treasurer, senator, 3 decades. And what is your legacy? A collection of one-liners, a greatest hits album of sound bites. She paused, letting the insult hang heavily in the air. You're not a legislator, Senator. You're a late-night comedian with a gavel. She then turned her gaze back to sweep across the full room, her voice rising in a practiced, theatrical crescendo, the unmistakable rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this exact speech in her head 100 times. While the planet burns, while families can't afford insulin, while children go hungry, this man sits in the most powerful legislative body in the world and crafts jokes. The American people don't need his Saturday Night Live routine. They need substance. They need policy. They need leaders who take the future seriously, instead of treating the Senate like open mic night at a comedy club. She whipped her head back to lock eyes with Kennedy. Your time cracking jokes while Rome burns is over, Senator. The next generation is here. We're not laughing. She abruptly dropped back into her chair with the heavy, decisive force of a period slamming down at the end of a sentence. A sudden ripple of excited applause erupted from the progressive organizations seated tightly together in the gallery rows. Down the dais, a young Democratic staffer leaned over and whispered a quick remark to a colleague, producing a wide, deeply satisfied smile. The digital machinery was already in motion. Within 90 seconds, the hashtag number AOC destroys Kennedy began trending nationwide on social media. She assumed she had just publicly humiliated him. She saw an old man sitting there in his reading glasses, scribbling on a yellow pad, and she possessed the arrogant certainty that she had won. She completely forgot one small, vital detail. John Kennedy had graduated from Oxford University with first-class honors. He had successfully managed $20 billion in complex pension funds for 16 years without losing a single dime, and he had spent his entire tenure in the United States Senate patiently waiting for someone young enough and arrogant enough to mistake his profound silence for stupidity. Kennedy did not flinch during any of it. He sat precisely in the exact posture he had held before, reading glasses resting on his nose, legal pad open, pen resting loosely in his hand. If anything, the rigid lines of his face had softened slightly during the blistering attack, adopting the calm, knowing expression of a man who was watching an event that perfectly confirmed a deep suspicion he had harbored for a very long time. When the applause finally faded and the tense room resettled into an anxious hum, Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham leaned toward his microphone, looking down the long dais. Senator Kennedy, you've been referenced directly. Would you like to respond during your questioning time? Kennedy moved with agonizing deliberation. He reached forward, took a slow, measured sip of water, and set the glass down silently on the wood. He then slowly removed his reading glasses, untucked his patterned tie, and began to carefully wipe the lenses clean, taking approximately 6 excruciating seconds to perform a task that typically requires 2. He moved the way a man does when he possesses all the time in the world and fully intends to weaponize every single second of it. John Kennedy inherently understood that maintaining absolute silence following a vicious attack was infinitely more devastating than any immediate defensive retort. He calmly slid the glasses back onto his face, looked down at his yellow legal pad, raised his eyes to meet Ocasio-Cortez's stare, and smiled. It was not a broad, theatrical grin. It was not a smug, triumphant sneer. It was the small, terrifyingly private smile of a hunter who has just been handed the exact prey he was looking for. Mr. Chairman, I surely would, Kennedy stated softly, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. He turned his body slightly to face his accuser. Representative, that was entertaining. I mean that sincerely. You've got real talent. Your delivery is first rate. His thick Louisiana drawl remained completely unchanged, holding the exact same warm, gravelly cadence his father and grandfather had spoken with before him. Reminds me of my neighbor Boudreaux's daughter. She comes down to Thanksgiving every year with big, elaborate plans for how we ought to run the family ranch. Never actually fed a chicken, mind you. Never mucked a stall. Never balanced the complex books on a working livestock operation. But Lord, she's got plans, color-coded binder, and everything. A low, involuntary laugh rippled straight through the Republican side of the dais, cutting the tension like a knife. Even one Democratic senator accidentally let a small, amused smile escape before quickly catching himself, remembering the grim partisan optics of the moment. Kennedy's expression shifted, the faint smile vanishing as he opened a fresh page on his legal pad, a page entirely covered in tight, impossibly precise handwriting. Now Representative Kennedy continued, the warmth draining from his tone, replaced by an icy surgical precision. You just spent 2 full minutes calling me a comedian, saying I've got no substance, that I am all jokes and no policy. I want to thoroughly test that theory today because I've been taking some notes during your presentation and I've got a few questions regarding your substance. And I heavily suspect the substance might be significantly thinner than the soaring rhetoric. He pressed a heavy index finger against the top of the yellow page. I've got 5 specific lessons I'd like to carefully walk through with you, Representative, not as petty insults, as lessons. Because you boldly stated you want substance, and I am going to give you more raw, unfiltered substance in the next 20 minutes than you have received in your entire 6 years sitting in the United States Congress. The C-SPAN cameras pushed in tighter, framing the confrontation as Kennedy began his systematic dismantling. Lesson 1, he announced, how math works. Representative, you just spent 10 minutes presenting the Green New Deal to this committee. You branded it an investment, not a cost. You declared it a framework for the future. You claimed anyone who opposes it is actively choosing profit over the planet. Kennedy lowered his chin, peering directly over the top rims of his glasses. Okay, let's talk about it, not the flowery rhetoric. Let's talk about the math. Because I managed $20 billion of other people's hard-earned money for 16 years as the Louisiana State Treasurer, and the most vital lesson I learned is that the absolute difference between a good idea and a bankrupt idea is usually a calculator. He leaned forward slightly. How much does the Green New Deal cost, Representative? Ocasio-Cortez quickly grabbed her microphone, leaning aggressively into the airspace. Senator, the Green New Deal is a comprehensive framework, not a single isolated piece of legislation. The exact cost heavily depends on the implementation specifics that a Representative Kennedy interrupted sharply, his voice slicing through her talking points. I didn't ask you to describe a framework. I asked you for a number. Your own congressional office published a detailed cost analysis. Your own political surrogates have repeatedly cited the figure on television. What is the number? A visible flicker of unease crossed Ocasio-Cortez's face as she physically shifted in her large leather chair. Various independent economic analyses have estimated $93 trillion, she conceded defensively. $93 trillion, Kennedy repeated. He delivered the colossal figure with the clinical detachment of an oncologist delivering a terminal diagnosis clearly stripped of all emotion and leaving absolutely zero room for misunderstanding. Over 10 years. That is not my number, Representative. That is not Fox News's manufactured number. That is the exact mathematical number directly derived from the policy proposals outlined in your own resolution. He smoothly picked up his pen and began writing aggressively on the legal pad, doing the complex arithmetic in real time, live for the national television cameras. 93 trillion, completely divided by 330 million living Americans. That mathematically equates to roughly $281,000 per individual person. For a standard family of 4, that is $1.1 million. He looked up from the pad, locking his eyes onto hers. The median household income in this country is approximately $75,000 per year. You are standing here asking the average working American family to absorb a crushing financial burden, roughly 14 times their total annual income. He set the pen down with a loud, audible click against the wood. Now, Representative, I personally managed a massive pension fund, teachers' pensions, firefighters' pensions, nurses' retirements. Real, tangible money belonging to real, hard-working people who were deeply counting on it to be able to afford to eat when they turned 70 years old. If I had arrogantly walked into a board meeting and declared, I've got a truly great investment, it will only cost you 14 times your annual salary, but I can't tell you exactly how it will be funded, they would have fired me. He paused, letting the silence crush the oxygen out of the room. Not next week. Not after a lengthy internal review. That afternoon, they would have had security escort me out of the building before the lunch hour. Senator, the catastrophic cost of complete inaction on global climate change is estimated by leading economists to be far, far greater. Ocasio-Cortez interjected loudly, her voice spiking in pitch, desperately trying to wrestle back control of the narrative. That is a very fine bumper sticker, Representative Kennedy replied softly, his tone completely devoid of hostility. If anything, his voice radiated the patient, slightly patronizing warmth of a seasoned bank manager explaining compound interest to a financially illiterate college freshman. But bumper stickers do not balance federal budgets. When I specifically asked you for a hard number, you aggressively gave me a framework. When I gave you the number, your own number, you reflexively gave me a political slogan. That is not substance, Representative. That is exactly what we call down in Louisiana, all hat and no cattle. He glanced back down at his meticulous notes. There's a fellow back home named Boudreaux, the exact same one whose daughter has all those ranch plans. Boudreaux came to my office once when I was the state treasurer with an elaborate proposal to aggressively build a massive catfish farm. Beautiful, stunning proposal. Glossy, thick paper, full-color photographs. Expensive charts with arrows pointing up and to the right. I sat there and I said, Boudreaux, I genuinely like the grand vision. How much does it actually cost? And he looked at me and said, John, it's not about the exorbitant cost. It is about the incredible opportunity. I looked right back and said, Boudreaux, I cannot eat an opportunity. How much? Kennedy let out a short, dry breath. He never did answer the question. That catfish farm never got built. And Boudreaux still owes me the money for the coffee. I politely bought him at that meeting. He locked his gaze directly onto Ocasio-Cortez's face. Your Green New Deal is Boudreaux's imaginary catfish farm, Representative. A truly beautiful vision, a spectacular color-coded binder. But the exact second somebody asks you about the basic math, you immediately change the subject to the weather. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw visibly tightened, the muscles clenching hard under her skin. Her right hand subtly but fiercely gripped the sharp edge of the witness table. It was a microscopic movement, a physical betrayal of intense, boiling anxiety. But the high-definition C-SPAN camera that had been slowly, agonizingly tightening its frame on her face for the past 2 minutes captured the raw discomfort in devastating detail. Lesson 1. Representative Kennedy concluded with absolute finality. Substance fundamentally starts with math, not carefully poll-tested slogans. Math. And 93 trillion divided by 330 million people is a fundamental number you should have been able to recite in your sleep before you ever walked through those doors into this room. With a sharp flick of his wrist, Kennedy turned the yellow page. Lesson 2. How money works. Specifically, your money. He calmly reached over and pulled a crisp white document from a manila folder resting beside his pad. It was not highly classified. It wasn't overly dramatic. It was a standard printed summary, heavily bearing the official, imposing seal of the House Ethics Committee. September 13, 2021, Kennedy read aloud, his voice steady, the exclusive Met Gala. You enthusiastically attended the event wearing a stunning white dress, specifically designed by Aurora James, with the highly visible words "Tax the Rich" written in bold red letters across the back. The baseline ticket price for that single event was $35,000 per person. He peered at her, his eyes unblinking. Now, I deeply appreciate the profound irony of the gesture. Wearing "Tax the Rich" to an elitist party that costs more money to enter than most hard-working Americans earn in 6 grueling months. That is either exceptionally clever or it is very much something else. But let us entirely move past the flashy symbolism and dig directly into the substance. He raised the document. In July 2025, the bipartisan House Ethics Committee officially released its devastating findings regarding your attendance at the Met Gala. The committee formally found that you explicitly violated the House gift rule. You knowingly received impermissible, extravagant gifts in direct connection with the event, including the exorbitant ticket, the custom dress, designer accessories, and high-end hair and makeup services. You were legally ordered to pay approximately $2,733 in forced restitution, plus a $250 late payment penalty. Kennedy laid the report flat on the desk, pressing his palm against it. But the stark violation itself isn't the most interesting part, Representative. The truly interesting part is precisely how you deceptively handled the official paperwork. He quoted directly from the dry legal text. "To successfully gain free, unrestricted admission for your fiancé, Mr. Riley Roberts, you officially designated him as your legal spouse on the mandatory event documentation. That specific, calculated designation triggered a rare exception to the stringent gift rule that legally allows spouses of elected members to attend lavish events without the astronomical gifts, counting against the members' strict legal limits. He let the ethical implications saturate the quiet room. However, and this is where the lesson gets particularly educational. On your official congressional financial disclosure, filings which are strictly required by both House rules and federal law, you intentionally did not list Riley Roberts as your spouse. Why? Because legally listing someone as a spouse on those sworn federal forms legally requires publicly disclosing all of their private financial assets, their total income, and their hidden liabilities. Kennedy stared at her with the mild, intensely curious expression of an IRS auditor who had just found a smoking gun buried deeply inside a complex tax return. Spouse when you desperately needed free admission to a $35,000 elite party. Not spouse when it legally meant showing the American public exactly where his money comes from. The silence was deafening. Representative, I am absolutely not a complicated man, Kennedy drawled softly, but even an old country lawyer like me can clearly see the dark geometry of that specific arrangement. And the House Ethics Committee clearly saw it too. Ocasio-Cortez's physical composure was desperately holding on, but the tremendous effort required to maintain it was rapidly becoming visible to millions of viewers. The fierce micro-tension tightening around her jawline and the frantic darting movement of her eyes were the exact frantic, tells that highly paid debate coaches train their desperate clients to suppress, and that seasoned camera operators are expertly trained to isolate and capture. Kennedy did not give her a single second to breathe or formulate a response. But the Met Gala is hardly the only glaring financial question festering in your official record, Representative. Let's talk about your former chief of staff. He flipped another crisp page. Saikat Chakrabarty, your very first and undeniably most influential chief of staff. In 2019, the respected National Legal and Policy Center filed a massive, detailed complaint, formally alleging that Mr. Chakrabarty intentionally transferred over $1 million from a powerful political action committee he personally controlled, routing it darkly through obscure entities legally described in the sweeping complaint as shell companies. companies that Chakrabarty also directly controlled. The grave allegation was that these complex transfers were maliciously structured to deliberately circumvent strict federal campaign finance public disclosure requirements. Kennedy locked his eyes onto hers like a vice. Mr. Chakrabarty abruptly departed your congressional office shortly after that devastating complaint was formally filed. Now, no formal criminal charges were ever brought against you, Representative. But let me tell you this. When your top chief of staff covertly moves $1 million rapidly through dark shell companies and then suddenly flees your office in the dark of night, in 30 years of practicing law, I have found that specific pattern highly tends to mean something. It rarely, if ever, means everything is just fine. Before she could object, he produced yet another printed document, holding it up like a damning piece of physical evidence in a murder trial. More recently, 2025. The exact same National Legal and Policy Center filed an additional, highly disturbing complaint regarding approximately $20,000 in massive campaign expenditures quietly paid out to a Dr. Brian Boyle, a licensed psychiatrist. Your campaign falsely reported these massive payments as leadership, training, and counseling. The complainant astutely noted that Dr. Boyle's professional medical website strictly does not list leadership training and counseling anywhere among his offered services. His listed medical specialties include, among other highly clinical things, ketamine-assisted therapy. Kennedy's voice dropped to a grave, serious register. I am absolutely not going to publicly speculate about what those intense sessions were, Representative. That is your private, personal, medical business. But campaign funds are public money. They are hard-earned dollars donated strictly for political purposes. And when massive amounts of public money secretly goes to a psychiatrist for medical services he does not publicly offer, the American voters are constitutionally entitled to ask exactly what they are paying for. He meticulously set the stack of damning documents aside and carefully folded his weathered hands together on the desk. Representative, you confidently walked into this hearing wearing Tax the Rich as your personal corporate brand. But your own documented financial record aggressively shows formal ethics violations at a billionaire's lavish party, a former chief of staff who darkly moved $1 million through shadowy shells and $20,000 in raw campaign funds funneled to a doctor for services he does not publicly advertise. You looked at me and told the world I am all jokes and absolutely no substance. Well, here is some brutal substance for you. Every single fact I just meticulously cited is heavily documented, entirely public, and legally verified. He tapped the pile of papers. The Ethics Committee report has your name permanently stamped on it. The explosive FEC complaint has your chief of staff's name plastered on it. The campaign disbursement legal filings have Dr. Boyle's name printed on them. That is not comedy, Representative. That is a forensic audit. And the loud woman who desperately wants to tax the rich seemingly cannot manage to accurately balance her own campaign's checkbook. Kennedy turned another page on his yellow pad, relentless and perfectly on schedule. Lesson 3, how hypocrisy works, because this one honestly is my absolute personal favorite. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Representative, I am going to do something that might seem highly unusual for a grumpy old senator who has just been publicly called a comedian. I am going to pay you a very sincere compliment. Ocasio-Cortez stared back at him with the profound, hollow weariness of a political fighter who had painfully learned over the past 10 brutal minutes that Kennedy's polite Southern courtesy was simply the razor-sharp knife, not the comfortable handle. You have brilliantly built one of the absolute most successful political brands in modern American political history, Kennedy stated, his voice laced with genuine objective respect for the machinery of it. 36 million desperate followers on Instagram. Glossy, high-fashion magazine covers, lucrative, glowing documentary deals, you miraculously turned bartender from the Bronx's into a massive, lucrative global identity. That takes real, undeniable talent. I mean that sincerely. Massive corporate marketing companies rigorously study your daily operation. He paused, the silence stretching taut. But here is the fatal thing about brands, Representative. A brand is a solemn promise. And when the promise aggressively fails to match the actual product, the people notice. They might not notice right away. They might not notice this year. But eventually, the massive, glaring gap between exactly what you loudly say and exactly what you quietly do gets wide enough that even your biggest, most loyal fans can see the bright daylight shining right through it. He looked down at a new section of his impeccably organized notes. You forcefully told American school children on camera in your official capacity to radically skip eating meat and dairy for a meal as a grand personal climate action. Yet, your own political campaign during that exact same period spent approximately $50,000 at ultra-luxury hotels, high-end fine dining restaurants, and lavish entertainment venues down in Puerto Rico, including, according to your own legally mandated FEC filings, a venue directly associated with a massive Bad Bunny concert. Kennedy didn't blink. Skip meat and dairy. Unless you're partying in Puerto Rico on donor money, then it's five-star resort dining. He plowed forward seamlessly before she could even draw a breath to respond. You aggressively championed public transit as the ultimate green alternative to destructive personal vehicles. Yet your own campaign's official transportation expenditures show the massive, extensive use of Uber and Lyft ride-sharing services, including for incredibly short trips where public transit was readily available within easy walking distance of your luxurious departure point. Take the filthy subway. Unless it's you, then it's a private Uber. His voice was a steady, rhythmic hammer. You loudly advocated for drastically reducing air travel in favor of environmental rail. Your own extensive travel records include numerous flights on short routes where Amtrak service was readily available and, in some documented cases, highly competitive on total time. Take the slow train. Unless it's you, then it's a first-class flight. And then Kennedy sighed heavily, shaking his head. There is the infamous Vanity Fair cover, $14,000 spent on extravagant clothing for a single glossy photo shoot. He leaned in, his voice hardening. For vital context, Representative, $14,000 is roughly exactly what a struggling home health aide working in your own impoverished district earns in 4 agonizing months of backbreaking labor. The woman who boldly claims to represent some of the absolute poorest, most desperate neighborhoods in New York City happily posed for an elite fashion magazine draped in an outfit that would take her average, exhausted constituent a third of a year just to afford. Kennedy reached up, slowly took off his glasses entirely, and placed them firmly on the wooden desk, the specific, deliberate physical gesture he employed when he wanted to speak raw truth with absolutely zero barrier between himself and his captive audience. Now, I am absolutely not a socialist, Representative, he stated clearly. I firmly believe people should be able to spend their own money however they damn well please. You legally earned that opportunity. You are entirely entitled to own nice things. But when you aggressively build your entire massive political identity on being the fierce, uncompromising champion of struggling working families, and then you quietly live exactly like the wealthy elite that those working families violently resent, that is not progressive politics. That is exactly what my late mama would have called preaching water and drinking wine. He methodically picked his glasses back up and slid them onto his face. You arrogantly asked why I make jokes, Representative. Here is exactly why. Because sometimes the glaring gap between what somebody self-righteously says and what they secretly do is so absurdly wide that a sharp joke is the only honest, rational response left. A woman wearing Tax the Rich while dancing at a $35,000 elite gala is a joke. Not because she is stupid, you are clearly a highly intelligent woman, but because the sheer contradiction is so enormously grotesque that laughter is the only sane human reaction. Kennedy leaned back, resting his hands on his stomach. That is exactly why they are legally required to print simple directions on the back of a shampoo bottle, Representative, not because normal people can't figure it out, but because some arrogant folks are so incredibly busy screaming at everyone else about exactly how to wash their hair that they completely forget to check whether they are holding the damn bottle upside down. At the witness table, Ocasio-Cortez abruptly uncrossed her arms, fiercely crossed them again, and shifted her entire body weight in her large chair. Her defensive, erratic body language was a glaring, undeniable semaphore of pure discomfort, a physical breakdown that 20 million captivated C-SPAN viewers were actively reading and dissecting in real time. Kennedy calmly turned another yellow page with the chilling, icy calm of an executioner who is entirely on schedule. Lesson 4, how the federal government actually works. Because this is the exact part where it gets highly personal for me. He locked his jaw. Since you maliciously attacked my long record, Representative, you aggressively called me a man with 30 years in government and absolutely nothing to show for it. I want to address that directly. Because unlike your other baseless accusations, this one I take extremely personally. He set his pen down completely, abandoning his notes, and spoke with raw, unvarnished intensity directly from memory. In 16 long years serving as the Louisiana State Treasurer, I successfully managed the state's massive pension fund for public employees. $20 billion. Teachers, firefighters, exhausted nurses, beat police officers, state maintenance workers, good, hard-working people who spent their entire physical careers selflessly serving Louisiana and who were desperately counting on that exact fund to feed them when they finally retired. His voice resonated with deep, protective pride. During my tenure, the fund's financial returns consistently met or wildly exceeded strict national benchmarks. We implemented aggressive reforms that severely reduced Wall Street management fees and massively increased public transparency. When I finally left that office, the fund was structurally stronger than when I found it. Now, that is not glamorous work, Representative. It absolutely does not make for a cool Instagram post. Nobody in New York City does a glossy Vanity Fair cover shoot about municipal pension fund management. But every single retired teacher in the state of Louisiana who cashes a secure pension check today is cashing a check that I personally helped protect. Kennedy pointed a thumb at his own chest. In 8 years in this Senate, I have heavily worked on complex banking reform, agricultural policy, desperately needed disaster relief for Louisiana. We get hit with a lot of hurricanes, you might have briefly heard, judicial confirmations, and strict, rigorous oversight of federal spending. Again, not flashy, not glamorous, not viral, but real. He immediately snapped his gaze back to the legal pad, opening it to a heavily marked page split cleanly into 2 long columns. Now, let us closely examine your legislative record, Representative. 6 loud years in Congress. He slowly dragged his fingers straight down the entire left column. Official bills solely sponsored by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that were ultimately signed into federal law as standalone legislation. 0. He stopped speaking, letting the brutal, echoing reality of the word zero hang suspended in the dead air for 3 agonizing seconds. Now, to be completely fair, Kennedy offered a razor hidden in the velvet. That specific number demands necessary context. Passing standalone bills is notoriously hard, especially when you are operating from the political minority. Most members don't pass very many, but you have actively been in the absolute majority. During the 117th Congress, when your Democratic Party completely controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, that was your golden window. Every single massive legislative advantage was heavily in your favor. And during that unprecedented window, your ultimate signature legislation, the Green New Deal, was finally put to a formal floor vote in the Senate. Kennedy's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. Not a single senator voted for it. Not even the progressive senators who had loudly, publicly praised your stunning courage and brilliant vision on cable news. When it finally came time to actually put their permanent names on the binding legal document, they cowardly voted present. They wouldn't even vote no. They just completely declined to participate in your fantasy. He began listing her failures with rhythmic, crushing speed. Your highly touted Just Society suite of sweeping bills. Comprehensive, massively ambitious. I will gladly give you that. Did not pass. Your aggressive credit card interest rate cap, authored alongside Senator Sanders, did not pass. Your radical Public Banking Act did not pass. Kennedy's finger slid over to the right column on his notepad, co-sponsored legislation that actually became law. 14 minor bills during your first term, handful of adopted amendments, including a highly commendable one redirecting $5 million from the DEA directly to vital opioid treatment. I give you massive, sincere credit for that. Real credit. He looked up, his expression hardening into stone. But Representative, simply co-sponsoring a massive bill is exactly like standing, smiling in the big group photo. The vital question the voters want to know is whether you were actually sweating in the kitchen, cooking the hard meal, or if you just showed up at the very end for the dessert. He decisively slapped the legal pad closed. You have 36 million Instagram followers, Representative, and exactly 0 federal laws with your name permanently on them. I have about 400,000 followers on the social media garbage my young staff violently forces me to use, and 30 years of grinding public service where the hard numbers actually added up and the heavy checks actually cleared. He stared intensely, directly into her soul. You aggressively called me a comedian with a gavel. You loudly mocked that my only legacy is cheap one-liners. But here is the absolute fundamental difference between us. When my career is fully over, retired teachers down in Louisiana will still cash secure pension checks that I help fiercely protect. When your career is over, people will just have pretty screenshots. Kennedy tilted his head, his voice dripping with genuine, lethal curiosity. Between the two of us, Representative and I asked this with absolutely 0 hostility. Who exactly is the walking punchline? Ocasio-Cortez desperately opened her mouth. 3 separate, frantic sentences rapidly began and violently died in her throat in the agonizing space of 4 seconds. Senator, you're deliberately stop. My record on critical amendments and fierce advocacy, stop. The legislative process doesn't simply measure impact through stop. Every single desperate sentence violently collapsed in on itself because John Kennedy hadn't attacked her progressive ideology. If he had predictably called her socialism evil, she had a fiery, rehearsed speech locked and loaded for that. If he had ignorantly denied climate change, she had an explosive viral speech prepared for that. But he hadn't done either. He had surgically attacked her basic fundamental effectiveness. He exposed the massive, humiliating distance between her boundless, loud ambition and her utterly barren results. And she was brutally discovering in real time on national television that she had absolutely 0 prepared snappy response for the undeniable mathematical observation that 6 years of being the absolute loudest voice in the United States Congress had produced the quietest legislative record in modern history. Kennedy watched her visibly drown, searching frantically for words, with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite arrogant satisfaction. It was the exact disappointed expression of an old, strict professor who has asked a remarkably fair question and is now genuinely curious whether the panicked student has bothered to do the assigned reading. She hadn't. Take your time, Representative Kennedy offered quietly, the silence gnawing at her. Lesson 5 is the last one, and I deeply think it is the most important. Kennedy's gravelly voice fundamentally changed. Not dramatically. It didn't rise to anger or drop to a patronizing softness. It shifted to something profoundly, uncomfortably personal. It was the rare voice of a guarded politician who was about to say something he actually deeply means, rather than something he has coldly calculated for the cameras. Representative, I want to frankly talk about your personal story, not your policy, your story. Because your story is at the absolute bleeding heart of everything you have massively built, and I think the hardworking American people deserve to finally hear it told completely accurately. He leaned his elbows on the desk. You have loudly told America that you are a scrappy, working-class bartender from the harsh streets of the Bronx. That specific story, working-class girl, serving drinks to survive, bravely running for Congress, shockingly beating the entrenched political establishment, is genuinely compelling. It is the absolute American dream. It is the exact kind of story this great country was proudly built on. But it is not quite the whole story. Kennedy was speaking entirely without looking at his notes for the very first time in the long hearing. You were born in the Bronx. That is true. But when you were about 5 years old, your family quickly moved to Yorktown Heights in wealthy Westchester County. He looked around the room. Now, for normal people who aren't from New York, and I'm proudly one of them, I'm just a Louisiana boy. Westchester County is literally one of the wealthiest, most elite counties in the entire state. The median household income there is roughly double the national average. The massive homes in Yorktown Heights average well over $500,000. Your father was a professional architect, Representative. That is a highly professional career. A damn good career. The kind of career that firmly puts you solidly in the upper middle class, the real middle class, not the cheap political talking point. He continued, his gaze unrelenting. You attended Yorktown Central High School, a massively well-funded elite public school in an incredibly affluent suburb where you safely participated in elite science competitions and proudly won awards. You then went on to Boston University, where the crushing tuition runs approximately $40,000 per year. After college, you bartended and waitressed. That is real, honest work. I deeply respect anyone who serves tables. I have said that publicly for decades, and I fiercely mean it. But the bartending was just a brief chapter, Representative. It was absolutely not the whole book. Kennedy looked at her with an intensity that seemed to physically pin her to the back of her chair. There is absolutely nothing wrong with your privileged background, not a single solitary thing. Growing up comfortably middle class in a highly safe, good suburb with a father who had a highly respected professional career is something to be profoundly proud of. Millions of desperate Americans would absolutely love to have had that safe, secure childhood. His voice dropped like an anvil. But that is not the story you constantly tell. You tell the gritty Bronx. You tell the exhausting bartending. You strictly tell the struggle. Because upper middle class girl from wealthy Westchester County simply does not fit the lucrative progressive brand. Kennedy leaned back slightly, his expression weary. Now here is where I strongly differ from some of my aggressive colleagues. Representative, I am not going to maliciously attack your background. I am simply going to tell you mine. He tapped his chest. I am from Zachary, Louisiana, population about 17,000 people. My mama was a public school teacher. My daddy worked incredibly hard. We were absolutely not rich, but we were never hungry. I had a truly good childhood. I went to good schools, Vanderbilt, UVA, Oxford, because I aggressively studied. I got incredibly lucky, and I had wonderful people who deeply believed in me. And here is the difference. I do not pretend any of that didn't happen. I absolutely do not build a massive brand on a heavily edited, manufactured version of my story that makes me sound more working class than I actually was. When folks ask me where I'm from, I look them in the eye and say Zachary, Louisiana. And I tell them, my mama was a teacher and my daddy worked hard. The silence in the room was absolute. I don't aggressively reinvent my entire childhood to perfectly fit a political narrative. You boldly told America you're strictly from the Bronx, you're heavily from Westchester. You told America you are working class. Your father was a professional architect. You told America you intimately understand crushing struggle. You went to a $40,000 a year private university. And then, after ruthlessly building that massive brand, you gleefully attended $35,000 elite galas. You happily wore $14,000 designer outfits. You casually spent $50,000 of donor money at luxury resorts, and you aggressively turned around and told exhausted working families to skip eating meat and dairy. His voice dropped to the quiet, terrifyingly low register that his captive audiences had long learned carried the absolute heaviest weight. Representative, that is not simple hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is merely doing the exact opposite of what you genuinely believe. This is something far more sinister. This is aggressively doing the opposite of what you pretend to believe. And the constant pretending, the utterly manufactured origin story, the highly curated focus group struggle, the lucrative brand of poverty that wildly contradicts the comfortable Westchester childhood or the elite Met Gala lifestyle that is the exact part that deeply bothers normal people. Not because they are petty or jealous of your massive success, because they desperately trusted the story and they found out the story wasn't entirely true. Senator John Kennedy didn't yell and he didn't pound the desk. Instead, with the terrifying calm of a man who had just dismantled an entire political narrative, he closed his yellow legal pad. With a sharp, echoing click of his pen, he delivered his final blow, a devastating homework assignment to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He challenged the viral Congresswoman to leave the glamorous world of exclusive galas and luxury island resorts behind. His mandate was simple but politically impossible. Go to a real working-class kitchen in the Bronx, sit across from a family making $40,000 a year, and explain without a teleprompter, camera crew, or Instagram filters exactly how her $93 trillion Green New Deal would actually help them survive. Show them the calculator, he demanded, leaving the crushing weight of reality to settle over the silent room. When Chairman Lindsey Graham offered the floor for a response, the massive hearing room held its collective breath. For a politician globally famous for her rapid-fire, camera-ready rhetoric, what happened next was shocking. Ocasio-Cortez leaned into the microphone, but her response was halting and brutally unfinished. She started, stumbled, and stopped. She tried to pivot to moral frameworks and fierce advocacy, but Kennedy had already systematically neutralized every rhetorical escape route. Then came the unthinkable, 8 full seconds of absolute unbroken silence. In her 6 years of dominating the political social media landscape through thousands of hostile interviews and viral moments, she had never been left entirely speechless on camera. Kennedy simply watched with the profound patience of a veteran teacher waiting for an honest answer before quietly packing up his notes, yielding his time, and walking out. The political fallout was instantaneous and explosive. Before Senator Kennedy's shoes even reached the Capitol hallway, the internet was flooded with 6 distinct, devastating clips. From the $281,000 per person mathematical reality check to the agonizing 8 seconds of silence, the footage shattered the polished political brand. Small dollar fundraising immediately cratered as donors paused to process the stark contrast. A political empire built on focus group slogans had just been completely audited by a country lawyer, armed with a simple calculator and 30 years of unassailable receipts. Across the country, from a disillusioned home health aide in the Bronx wanting real answers to a high school government class in Louisiana learning the importance of showing your work, the message was crystal clear: substance defeats slogans. But the homework is still due. The damning ethics findings remain permanently stamped on the public record. The massive campaign finance discrepancies are still entirely unanswered. And the entire Washington establishment is holding its breath to see if she can salvage the empire she built. Just as her panicked team scrambles to draft a desperate counteroffensive, a sudden blinding flash of notification has just pinged across the committee's digital docket. A secondary, highly classified financial inquiry has just been aggressively triggered, and this time the cameras absolutely aren't turning off. What exactly is hidden in this explosive new inquiry? And could it be the final blow to one of the biggest political brands in America? You will not want to miss what happens next. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications right now so you are the first to know when we drop the next video uncovering these classified details. The political storm is just getting started. We'll see you in the next one.